Well, good evening, everybody. Just a forewarning, 3 of the 4 quiz questions will come from the economic portion of this presentation. So you better take good notes because I know this is everybody's favorite part of all this. So I'm going to be providing the 2021 Utah hay outlook. And this is going to be based on a lot of research we've done, kind of looking at how we predict hay markets. And so I'm going to be using a model that we've built to help do that. And so with that, what we did is we identified key drivers. So we wanted to say, okay, Utah hay prices, we know that we don't live in a vacuum, and there's going to be key drivers that really impact what we see for prices. So we're going to identify those key drivers, and then we're going to estimate that 2021 Utah hay price. Just like any forecast, that can change dramatically with any major event. So it's going to be the best representation based on the data that I have available. So when we look at these key drivers, this is what we found. So you can see here, there's 5 key variables that will explain 90% of the change in Utah hay prices. So when we look at some of these, so the 7 Western states hay stocks annual change, so the supply within our region, I'm looking at that national corn price, exports, which is a key demand driver, so the national milk price and feeder cattle price. So these are the 5 key drivers of Utah hay prices. And those numbers next to that in that middle column is simply the impact that variable has on Utah hay prices. So what we want to do is estimate the change in each one of those. Then we multiply it by what we call that coefficient, or just the impact. And that will give us the change in 2021 prices that we can predict based on 2020 prices. So that's where we want to end up when this is all said and done. So when we look at May hay stocks, so this was May 1st of 2020. So you can see this is the actual stocks. And if we look at this graph, it doesn't really give us a ton of information. We need to decide what's it relative to. So when we look at how it has changed, so this is the percent change from 2019 to 2020. So you can see, besides up there in the far northwest, everything else had a positive increase in hay stocks from 2019 to 2020.
No.
23% change in Nevada, 7% in Utah, 23% in Idaho. So we saw hay stocks increase across that based on May 1st. When we look at December hay stocks, we want to look at December hay stocks. And unfortunately, USDA hasn't released the official 2020 numbers, so we're doing a little interpolation here. But you can see here's the trend from 2015 to 2020. December hay stock. So looking at that, we saw that reduction from 2016 to 2019 in those stocks, and then in 2020 we saw that rise. And so we're going to use that same trend to kind of predict where we're going to be in 2021. That slight change in hay stocks. So based on that, we're going to show that slight increase. And so we're predicting that those hay stocks will increase and thus decrease that price. So supply, I think of just standard supply and demand. As supply increases, price drops. So we're increasing supply and decreasing price roughly $19. So just an estimate. So that's our first key driver of what's going to happen as we go through 2021. Next one we want to look at is corn prices. And I'm sure many of you have been following corn prices lately. And when we look at that, you can see it. Corn prices actually have a high. That's a pretty big coefficient or big impact that has on hay prices. So we want to watch that pretty close. When we look at these are the futures contract as of just the other day. So as of these may have changed since then, but at that point in time, that March 2021, May 2021, you can see those future contracts, and we're bumping up against that $5 level, which we haven't seen in quite a while. When we compare that to 2020, we're $1 difference, 93 cents, 88 cents, 55 cents. So dramatically different from where we were a year ago. So corn price is projected to be quite a bit higher in 2021. So with that, we're projecting, just an average 75 cent increase. So that should drive up hay prices by $8.50, $8.45. Next one we want to look at is hay exports. Now, hay exports is a tough one. The data on this is sometimes difficult to find. And you can see here, it has a smaller impact. That number's quite a bit smaller. And so, but it's still a significant driver of those prices. And so when we look at this, this is coming out as of 2019, alfalfa hay in that darker blue, other hay in the lighter, but you can see that alfalfa hay has continued to increase. You know, there's been a positive trend since 2007 in hay exports and projecting that to increase. When we look at this a little closer here, so these are, when you look at some of the export data, it really separates it out by your 5 major trading partners. And within the alfalfa industry, those 5 are Japan, China, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. Those are our 5 key trading partners. And you can see China has the largest trading relationship with us. In 2019, so this blue, blue would be January through November of 2019. And the reason I did that is to compare January through November of 2020. So to compare apples to apples, we can compare that blue to the green. So 2020, we saw a dramatic amount of increase in alfalfa hay exports to China. When we look at those other 4 trading partners, slight decrease in Japan, slight decrease in the other ones. China absorbed a lot of that, but when we look at that as an aggregate, right? So we will see that. And so once again, just highlighting that change that occurred from January 2019 through November 2019, and then January 2020 through November 2020. So when we look at this on a percentage change, so blue in total, you can see that percentage change. There's hardly been any change over the past year. We saw that reduction in overall exports. And so I'm projecting that 2021 is going to have very slight change. So I'm not even going to show any change in hay exports. But as soon as I say that, tomorrow something will happen and that could change. And so just in your mind, just think, okay, so if hay exports, if I read an article that's saying hay exports have increased, know that should increase the price of hay here in Utah. So, but that's based on the data that I have. That's what I'm projecting. So milk prices, right? Milk prices. So for every percent change in milk, we can also see that change. When we look at milk, we've seen a lot of change, a lot of volatility as we've gone through this past few months in milk prices. So this is February 21 class 3 milk prices. Saw that dramatic change that happened within those milk prices. When we look at this on comparing those, so this is just looking at class 3. So January, it's relatively has not changed much, but when we look at February, April, June, we see some dramatic changes. As we go out later in the year, of course, we're going to see that that difference is not as great. But when we look at those earlier future months, we're seeing that change in milk prices. So based on that information, we're looking at a 47-cent change based on those future prices. So 69, round that up, just basically $1 should increase milk price, hay prices by $1 based on that increase in milk prices. Okay, so finally, when we look at these last one, which would be our feeder cattle, the driver that has, so feeder cattle, right? So this is our key impact here. We want to look at that national feeder cattle price, and we're looking at that on an annual change. So when we look at that on an annual basis, we're going to look once again at these futures contracts. Now, remember, some of you may be wondering, well, why aren't we using Utah prices? And we want to use national prices just because it takes out a lot of that basis or that localized information and really kind of just puts it on a level playing field. So when we look at some of these futures prices, so this is January 2021 through November 2021, we can see a slight reduction from 2020. So these feeder cattle future prices have really not moved and reduced since last year. So they're not where we want them to be, as this is driving a lot of the cow-calf prices. But so we're showing a slight reduction in those prices. So using that $10 difference, we're showing that feeder cattle price annual change is going to reduce hay prices by $4.10. So we put this all together. So this is what we wanted to end up with. We started with a blank table. So now we can add back in these. So we have our change from hay stocks, our supply, corn price, which is gonna drive that hay price, exports, which is a demand driver, milk price, demand driver, then that feeder cattle, which is also a demand driver. We're looking at all that change. So when we look at that, what USDA, now we know that there's a lot of variation from north to south, within the state of Utah. So this is just an average across the state. So you can look at it and say, well, I know in my region, that price is going to be a lot different. So when we look at that 180, which was our 2020 average price, and then we're going to reduce that. The sum of all those is going to be $14.44. So we're going to reduce that roughly by $15. So the projected price for 2021 is going to be projected to be less than what we saw in 2020, $1.66, 166. I apologize. Now take that with a grain of salt, because as I said earlier, this can change quite rapidly as we look at some of these, as we looked at 2020 and what could happen in 1 year, each one of these variables. But the key here is to look at the sign of these impacts. Increase in supply should decrease price. As corn price rises, it should increase our hay price. Exports, which is a demand driver, increases demand. As exports increases price. Milk price, increase price, and feeder. These are demand drivers that will increase price. So when you put that economist hat on as you're reading market updates or whatnot, you should be able to tell yourself, based on these prices, what I'm seeing, that's the impact it should have on what we're seeing. So when we look at that, key drivers, that supply side, demand side, estimated price. So one of the other topics that we're supposed to touch on was capturing market, increasing profitability through marketing opportunities. And within alfalfa, that's extremely difficult, just because there's no established forwards contract. And so the way to increase that profitability are twofold. One, increase quality, which will increase your overall selling price and decrease cost. 2021 could be a year that you should analyze every operating cost that's going into your operation. If there's any way to cut costs, it might be a good opportunity to do that. And on the quality side, we've seen that premium that comes with quality, and that is a constant. So if you can increase the quality of your alfalfa, that'll increase the overall price and should increase that overall profit margin that you would hope to get for that alfalfa. So with that, as always, please, you can contact me anytime. Here's my email, best way to contact me.